Good morning and welcome to the Point. Before that grand jury decision in Missouri took over the news cycle, all of the conversation was about President Obama's decision to let 5 million people remain in this country without the fear of deportation. That was the conversation we had when we sat down with one of the top-ranking Republicans from the Michigan delegation, Congressman Fred Upton. Let's start with where we are now. As you and I talk, you've got a brief break for the Thanksgiving holiday, and then it's right back to votes for you in the House. But it will come with a different atmosphere, I suspect, after the president made his speech last week talking about his initiative, his view of immigration reform. Talk to me both about the substance of what the president talked about and how that impacts members of the House and Senate who also feel like they have a voice in this.
Well, what's really disappointing is, and the president knew this when he, for weeks prior to when he made his executive order decision, he knew that it was going to hurt actually getting a legislative solution on immigration reform done. Immigration today, it's broken. As long as it stays this way, it'll perpetuate that broken system. It needs to be fixed. Yes, I do believe that there's a bipartisan solution that we can go about to get it done. But and the Senate did pass a bill back in 2013 for a number of reasons. It didn't, and nothing happened this year, primarily because Eric Cantor lost his election in the summer. But the ball was teed up. The word was out that, in fact, and a number of pretty important Republicans came out, Chuck Grassley and others, as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Look, we'll do it next year, early next year, House and Senate, bipartisan, to get this thing done. What the president did by saying, look, I'm going to do it on my own, really hurts, I think, cooperation. It sends a terrible signal, as we look at the next 2 years. To try and work together to try and get this thing done. Now, the president issued a challenge, just do a bill, here's what I'm going to do, number of holes in it. As I look at what he said, there's nothing in there relating to the agriculture sector of it. Well, that's, for us in Southwest Michigan, that's pretty big. I mean, we can't survive, our ag folks, fruit and vegetables, without that migrant workforce. That's got to be taken care of. So when we go back to Washington next week, and we're really in 2 more weeks, and then the new Congress will come in January, I think that it'll be the new Congress then that'll have to come back and say, look, we do, we need to certainly move on an ag sector, but we do need legislation. It has to be bipartisan. But with the president doing this, with all of the warning signals that he got, and there were a lot. I mean, some pretty major papers, as I recall, even the Washington Post said, wait till you can get a bipartisan solution, just wait to get things done. Clearly, I think it would have happened in the first quarter next year, but now you have the excuse, or a number of folks have the excuse of saying, we're not going to play. The president he has poisoned the well. It will be harder now to get legislation done because of what the president did. That's, I guess, the bottom line.
Well, and let me give you this scenario with which you may disagree, but when you say this gives some people the excuse, there are members who might have said, yeah, I'll go along with this, I'll work with you on this, but now their constituencies may have been riled up by what they perceive as something that may not be happening at all. But you get that group of people that get very motivated.
They light up the phone.
And the social media, right? Yep. And so that's what I assume you talk about when it gives people an excuse or cover.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's sort of like, oh, there he goes again, not working with the Congress, not trying to, get things done. And of course, remember, and some will say, the president, his first 2 years had an 86 vote majority in the House, 60-40 in the Senate. I mean, he had carte blanche in terms of getting anything done. There was nothing. They actually made the decision to do a couple of other bills ahead of immigration reform, and that's why we are where we are.
What does this do overall? And you alluded to this, but look, the relationship has never been good. Affordable Health Care Act passes with 0 Republican votes over in the House. You have voted to repeal that I don't know how many times. all of the arguments, all of the fights that have gone on during this administration. But what does this do now when you come back next year with majorities in both the House and Senate and 2 more years to go with this president and a presidential election looming out there?
Well, I tell you a couple of things that we're going to do, regardless of what the president did this last week on immigration. All of us are terribly frustrated with the dysfunction that we've seen in Washington the last couple of years. Ping pong back and forth, finger pointing, we got enormous problems in this country that we need to deal with. And now, given the opportunity, having a Senate with likely 54 Republicans, big cry from 45, and I expect the Louisiana race to go for Bill Cassidy, which is why I say 54. 247 in the House, where 218 is the controlling mark. We now, I believe, have the opportunity to show that Republicans can govern and set the stage for 2016. We have to deal with these issues. Yes, immigration is one of them. Budget certainty is another, which is why we don't want to, believe me, a budget shutdown. A couple of issues that we're dealing with, my committee on energy, whether it be energy conservation, whether it be Keystone, which has always had widespread bipartisan support. Even John Dingell, the first time, not the second, but the first time supported the Keystone Pipeline bill. Of course, he's the Dean of the House, former chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. An issue that we're going to talk about, I think, later on is 21st Century Cures. Again, a major bipartisan effort to expedite, speed up the approval of drugs and devices, patient-centered, do a number of things that the American government, the American public wants us to do. And so for the last, I'm not kidding, the last 2 months or so, our majority leader, Kevin McCarthy, has been meeting with each of the committees. We had another big meeting last week and again next week, to sit down and talk to the committee chairman and say, all right, what are some of those bills that we've been able to do that have been bipartisan, that we can tee up pretty quickly and get through our legislative process in the House and try to get them moving through the Senate. Now, the last 2 weeks now since the election, I've sat down with a number of senators to talk about some of our issues that we think that we can move, and really changes the whole dynamic of where we've been the last couple of years on what we can do early next year, particularly right off the bat. In fact, we're going to be in session, unusual, for the first 6 weeks of next year. Often, we were in 2 weeks, get to come home for a week and do the things, during the course of the week, like today, a Monday. Normally when we'd have votes, I couldn't be here. I'd got to be on a plane going back. But we're going to be in the first 6 weeks allowing us to organize, allowing us to begin to mark up these bills, get them to the House floor, and really change the dynamic of what we've seen in the past couple of years.
I do want to talk about some of the initiatives that you're taking in your committee. I also want to talk about some of the things. There are dozens, hundreds of bills that have been passed out of the House.
384
that have gone over to the Senate. And we know that not all of those are going to get action. But let's talk about Keystone. There's one that did see action post-election. Many would say, perhaps cynically, that was designed specifically to help Senator Landrieu down in Louisiana. She had an opportunity to make the case. Senate still fell short. Is Keystone going to be back in January?
Keystone, I think, will be up in January. I mean, this was an issue the last 2 weeks. Senator Landrieu, a Democrat, running for re-election. Louisiana's got this law that if you got to have a runoff, they don't have a primary, so if you don't get 50%, you have to take the top 2 people. So her election's December 3rd, or that's when it'll be decided. But she thought she would be able to get the votes to pass Keystone in the Senate and be able to, she's chair of the Senate Energy Committee, and she could show her constituents in Louisiana that yes, she made a difference and she could actually deliver. Lo and behold, she fell 1 vote short of even being able to debate the bill on the Senate floor, which is now why, now it's a major faux pas on her part, which is why Bill Cassidy, the Republican, actually a member of our House Energy and Commerce Committee, now shows that he has a double-digit lead with just a week and a half to go.
And it's lost on no one, the impact of oil and gas on Louisiana's economy. So it's not just a matter of national leadership, but it's also about taking care of folks back home, too, when it comes to Senate.
That's right. And she, they thought she could get the 60 votes, and she couldn't get it.
Let's talk for just a little bit about the fallout from this election, because you and I talk politics very often when the cameras are off. But you pick up over in the House, you pick up more seats over there.
14 seats.
And over in the Senate, obviously the majority changes hands. Going into this, there were numbers that were all over the place. A lot of people were predicting Senate races, but I had one pretty good prognosticator say, look, this thing could end up 50-50.
I was at 9, and that's what we got.
Yeah, and are you, since that's what you were already predicting, I guess you're not surprised, but did this election have the same uncertainty about it, the same feel of uncertainty for you as it did for some of us observing?
Well, it's I felt pretty confident about the numbers. Now I'm talking to a lot of folks all around the country. I did miss, I'll confess, I missed 2 races, but I lost one, won one, so the net was the same. I actually thought we'd win New Hampshire and lose North Carolina, and it was the reverse. But it's, people are, voters are just sick and tired of the gridlock that we've seen the last couple of years. For the Republican side, we didn't have any, quote, losers like we had a couple of years ago. Todd Akin from Missouri, if you study your politics, or Richard Murdoch down in Indiana. We didn't have anyone that's making some bad mistakes that actually, that was really where they were. So when you have quality candidates, when you talk about a positive vision of getting things done, of having a relationship with the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, you're going to, and it just happened that in a number of those states, we had politically, we were better off. 16 is a little bit different, and that's why it's important. The reason is that there are 8 Republicans up for re-election in 2016 whose states went for President Obama 2 years ago. So that's a whole new twist. We've got to see who the quality of the candidates are. But I think overall people are saying, let's get the job done. You've got 2 years to try and get there, sir. And our leadership knows, and I think you're going to see a real positive agenda the next couple of years.
While Congressman Upton was clearly not happy with the president's decision on immigration, he does think that there is room for bipartisan cooperation. We'll talk about that when we return to The Point. Welcome back to The Point. We're talking with Congressman Fred Upton about what he sees as the fallout from Decision 2014 and what Congress and the president might work on together going forward. Let's talk about this reconstituted Congress and the way it's going to look in January and some of what's going to happen. But I want to talk about it first from a Michigan perspective. Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee were all Michiganders. That's no longer going to be the case.
We've never been a stronger delegation in the last 2 years in terms of seniority and clout.
And I mean, these are significant, impactful committees. Now, over on the Senate side, you still have the Ag Committee chairmanship, and you will still be the chairman.
Well, no, Debbie will be ranking.
Oh, you'll be ranking member. That's right, you are. But you will be the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which, as we've talked about before, has broad purview over a lot of things. Talk to me a little bit about your initiative, starting with your cures.
Well, arguably, the Energy and Commerce Committee is with jurisdiction, is the most powerful committee in the House. Jurisdiction over commerce, manufacturing, trade, telecommunications, healthcare, energy, environment, and oversight. So, Takata airbag is our big issue now in the next week or two. We have a big initiative that we've been working on for more than a year now called 21st Century Cures. I'm the Republican lead on it. Diana DeGette, who's a subcommittee ranking member from a Democrat from Colorado, is my partner. For the last year, we've been going around the country listening, talking to researchers, talking to pharma, so the pharmaceutical companies, talking to the NIH, to the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, is all the patients groups. I did a big speech last week to the cancer folks. What can we learn from them to see how we can update and speed up not only clinical trials, but research and approvals of drugs and devices it's so frustrating. Now, we had a hearing earlier this year. 50% of the venture capitalists, the folks that actually fund a lot of the funding for the research for these new drugs and devices, are now going overseas. They're so frustrated with the approval process here that they've said, you know, we can get it done maybe years faster if we go to UK or New Zealand or someplace else, China. And so they're just closing up shop. Well, not only do we see then the delay for Americans for, you know, whatever that illness is, you know, we also see the jobs go there too. So we said, you know, let's do this the right way. Let's really spend the time, kick the tires, and figure out what we can do. And so early next year, January, we're going to be releasing what we call a committee draft or committee print, where it's going to have a whole lot of ideas of where we need to go. Again, that'll be shopped around. People can look at it. Oh, you missed this. You know, something here. Da 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 da. But our intent is that we will mark that bill up, introduce it, introduce it, and then mark it up, get it out of committee by Easter, which is the end of March, and on the House floor before Memorial Day, with the goal of getting it enacted, signed into law by President Obama before the end of next year. I had some meetings this last week with Republican senators. I'm going to be meeting again with some Democrats soon in the next 2 weeks to really keep that bipartisan, aura about this. And we feel very encouraged that it's going to go. It'll mean more research dollars, but my family's no different than anybody else. My wife's got lupus. My uncle had Parkinson's. My mom's a cancer survivor. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. Every family has those issues. And here is a way where we can actually make a difference and find a cure for these folks.
Talk to me about the bipartisan nature of this, because common sense and good policy don't always lead to bipartisanship in Washington. It's not always that way, unfortunately. But in this case and some other cases that we have discussed, and I might suggest on the agriculture bill over in the Senate.
Debbie Stabenow did a really good job on the farm bill.
I mean, she used the approach that you're talking about, bringing together stakeholders, not mattering so much about whether they're Republicans or Democrats, working with Pat Roberts, senator down in Kansas, who is interested in big crops, thousands and thousands of acres of wheat, where in Michigan we have a lot of specialty crops that need completely different types of help, but they were able to pull all of that together. How do you get to that point where common sense, good ideas, practicality can create bipartisanship, because it doesn't always?
A lot of one-on-one meetings. So we sat down, Diane and I sat down with, then it was Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader in the House. He lost his primary back in June, so Kevin McCarthy, the new guy on the block, I guess he was the whip before, but he's on board. Steny Hoyer, who used to be the majority leader under the Democrats, now he's the whip. He's the number 2 Democrat in the House. He's solidly on board. We sat down with the administration. Sylvia Burwell's the Secretary of HHS. She actually testified. We had about 24 hearings and roundtables, not only in D.C., but around the country as well. Pennsylvania, Florida. I spoke to a big group in Chicago. Kalamazoo we had when we had the head of the NIH come out to Kalamazoo back in October. Florida, Texas, all over the country, Denver. We got a lot of ideas from folks, but we worked very carefully to make sure that it was bipartisan, that it was not going to be one side punching out the other. Diana DeGette and myself are going to get together early in December. We're going to talk about, all right, here's what we have now. We want to make sure that it stays bipartisan. There are some groups that are going to be told, everyone sees this bill moving, so they're trying to get it, things attached to it. That's not our goal. We want to, this is going to make a difference for people, and we're going to work to keep it bipartisan and really through the process.
A couple of other things that are also within the purview of your committee, though unrelated to this. Let's talk about a couple of issues you've been working on. General Motors recalls ignition switches and now airbags that have a much broader throw, it would appear. with the number of vehicles involved, or at least with the number of brands involved. So talk a little bit about where we are with both of those.
Well, with GM, we had a hearing, actually we've had a couple hearings, lots of letters, over 1 million pages of documents we've collected in the last year. And of course, we had a relatively new chairman of GM, Maribera, came on board in January of this year. She's tried to make significant changes, change the silos, trying to change the information. We found some bad documents in there in terms of what people knew. And we're frustrated. I think we're all frustrated with the pace of actually replacing some of those ignition switches. But, you know, that's what the Oversight Subcommittee is supposed to do. I once chaired that. It's in our committee. Try to figure out what went wrong. Why didn't the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration get this thing figured out before a number of people were killed? So they've been under fire here as well. Are we going to see legislation come about for this? You know, we actually passed legislation a number of years ago. It actually was mine as it related to recalls and the information given to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. We may see something here. We're going to have a meeting early in December and see where we need to go. As it relates to Takata, here's an airbag manufacturer, and problems were discovered. And the question is, where did it get passed along to? Didn't really for a while, it appears. What did the auto companies know? So we're asking a couple of auto companies, and certainly the big focus is on Takata, but what did the auto companies know? They had a number of recalls. We're having the top 3 companies that had most recalls come in December 3rd, Honda, Toyota, and BMW. But the focus really is on Takata.
We'll
see what we learn.
Almost out of time, but I want to ask you this. Going back to Washington, you've been there in the minority. You've been there in dual minority, dual majority. You've seen it in all ways. Going back this January, understanding 2 years leading up to a presidential race, what is your anticipation? Obviously the things you talked about, but what is your anticipation about the tone in Washington, given all that we've just talked about?
Couple things, and you know this about me more than I am a Cubs fan, so I am an optimist, all right? And by the way, the Cubs are going to be in the hunt this year, I'm convinced. But I'm an optimist. You know, I saw with Ronald Reagan, and I worked at the Reagan White House, I saw a Republican president dealing very effectively with a Democratic Congress. And the proof in the pudding was he got 49 states when he ran for re-election. We've got to be, we as Republicans have to be careful that we don't overstep. Yes, you know, you got still a president who can veto a bill. We want him to sign bills. We want him to work in a bipartisan basis on the nation's ills that certainly and issues that confront us. And so I'm, you know, particularly the first, I'd say, 9-10 months, because after that, as you know, we get really caught up into the presidential politics. You know, is it going to be Hillary Clinton? Is it going to be, I saw a list of like 20 different Republicans that may be running. At some point, they take all the air in that balloon. They get it all. So we've got a year to really lay out an agenda, show the American public what we can do, pass bills that, yes, they're bipartisan. And, you know, if we can do that, I think we're in great stead for 2016. And the good news is, at least from the House perspective, our leadership wants to get that done too. John Boehner, Kevin McCarthy, Stephen Scalise, the new Republican whip, Kathy McMorris Rogers, the chair of the Republican conference. All of us are engaged with pretty good dialogue almost every single day on things that we can do that really moves the ball down the field.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. Congress will head back to Washington for a couple of weeks after Thanksgiving, but then it will be pretty quiet until after the first of the year. That's when Republicans will take charge of the U.S. Senate and increase their margins over in the U.S. House. And then we'll see if that bipartisan cooperation that Congressman Upton talked about can actually come to fruition. In the meantime, there are a lot of changes going on here in the state of Michigan as well. We'll be following all of those and keeping you updated right through the holiday season, including introducing you to some new legislators. I hope you'll join us next week. To the Point.